Before we begin, this video is sponsored by AG1. When it comes to the stresses of 2 jobs, running a business, paying bills, looking after a puppy, renovating a house, and maintaining social commitments, all while trying to train for several dodgeball leagues and international events, it's easy for me to forget the benefits of healthy nutrition when on perpetual autopilot. That's where AG1 steps in. AG1 is a daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health. All I do is drink AG1 each morning instead of my usual coffee routine, and over time, I started seeing the effects of improved energy, concentration, better digestion, and gut health thanks to replacing ungodly amounts of sugar and caffeine with a mixture of 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. And most of all, I just feel more alert and switched on, which is essential to both my jobs and competition days. As I've gotten older, I've slowly wised to how much a small adjustment to my morning routine leads to greater results in both my physical and mental well-being. Heck, when recording videos like this, I feel less stressed and zombified than I did before. I actually kind of enjoy recording now. In fact, some folks even commented on how energized I look in recent videos, and I attribute a big part of that to improving my diet and nutrition thanks to AG1. You can support both my channel and your own nutrition today by simply scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link below to get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 plus K2 and 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this video. At the start of last year, I talked about the pretty bad, albeit conceptually interesting, psychological horror The Boy, which starts out under the guise of a supernatural haunted doll movie, then reveals a few surprises before going back on itself in its out-of-nowhere sequel. Both films were directed by William Brent Bell, a horror filmmaker whose entire filmography can be described in one way: unique idea, bad execution, and you'll know what I mean if you've seen any of the following films shown on screen. However, the one film that caught many folks' attention was Bell's first horror film, Stay Alive, a largely forgotten, although seemingly cult-followed supernatural horror about a bootleg video game containing a curse that warns its players that if you die in the game, you die for real. I have for years wanted to cover this film on this channel, but just never came across a copy out in the wild, so many of you folks kindly offered to send me one, for which I am truly grateful. So over Christmas, I got my hands on 2 versions: the original UK version that I watched as a kid, but more excitingly, the US unrated version that contains violence, gore, sex, nudity, profanity, and drug use. All the things that are cut from the BBFC version that I watched. So naturally for this review, I'm going to cover this one because besides the fact that it has all the stuff that horror fans know and love, it also includes a new character and subplot, which I presume is meant to help us engage better with the story, but making this section after doing the actual review, I can tell you with hindsight, it does fuck all to benefit anything. Last thing I'll mention is that you will know when I show cut content because it has a weird compression to it compared to the theatrical edit, so keep that in mind. It's weird, but nonetheless, let's just dive into it. Oh yeah, I forgot. One of the beauties of old DVDs was the effort to push interactive elements, so Stay Alive has a character creation screen in the main menu, where if you pick the right combo of character, outfit, and weapon, you'll be treated to a short flash from the film, whereas if you get it wrong, you'll, well, still be treated to a short flash from the film. It's a pure nothing gimmick, so don't go in expecting anything you haven't seen before, but it is a nice nostalgic reminder of those mid-2000s DVDs, so no harm mentioning it, I guess. Our story begins in-game with a confusing mix of gameplay presented through cutscene first-person and third-person perspective, which to gamers is a significant technical nitpick, but I'm forgiving of it because it reminded me so much of those old PS1 point-and-click games I used to play, like Dracula and Necronomicon. It's nostalgic to a very obscure degree, even harkening back to those light gun arcade games I used to play at my local bowling alley, like House of the Dead or Clown Evil, which I've actually mentioned in previous videos, I believe, but with the number of analog PS1 style horror games being made these days, like those from Papa Combo, I really want to see more PS2 era Uncanny Valley games like this. If you have a passion for horror games, you'll appreciate what Stay Alive is going for with its niche gaming references, but it can be polarizing in other places, like being prone to the same kind of cliches and stereotypes you see even today that give it a sort of boomer quality to it. We're introduced to Loomis, the brother of our main protagonist Hutch, who's beta testing a new game called, would you believe it, Stay Alive, which he claims to be the scariest thing he's played since Fatal Frame, a bold statement to say the least. In the game, Loomis is exploring a spooky New Orleans gothic house when his character is abruptly murdered by a woman in red. He calls it a night and decides to check on his roommates who previously died in the game, and he finds them having shining like sexual shenanigans because unrated 0.3, sex and nudity. From here, the film exposes one of its worst features, the feature that it probably should do best at, which is that it has a painful lack of genuine tension, scares, or suspense. It's textbook cliche in the sense that there's no style or substance to any of its delivery, outside basic bitch shadows, poor lighting, and eccentric cocaine-fueled jump scare editing that plagued much of the early to mid-noughties. Most folks will find it laughable, but I'll admit I do kinda like the use of a controller vibration to signal the arrival of the main threat, because it's just B-movie enough to invite a modest sense of charm. Yeah, sure, I'm grasping at the finest of straws, but it's emblematic of what I think the film is mostly missing, a sense of humor and fun with the concept. I mean, it does have a comic relief character to demonstrate some self-awareness, but he isn't in it long enough to make much of an impact. At least The Ring had a strong, convincingly enigmatic story to balance out what is still ultimately a far-fetched concept, but a killer video game is inherently harder to ground in seriousness. When your character dies in the game, as is the case with Loomis and his friends, you are then murdered by the mysterious Lady in Red in the exact same way you died in the game, which for Loomis's friends is being gored to bits, while Loomis is hanged from the ceiling. It's not a strong sell on the horror side, but it does leave you intrigued enough to see what the game is all about, thus putting us in the shoes of Hutch, whose blank slate of generic male protagonist is ironically fitting to the default template of every character creation screen. At his brother's funeral, we're introduced to Abigail, a friend of one of the victims, who inappropriately takes intrusive photos of a grieving Hutch, and in her words, other crying faces like some sort of suspicious sociopath. I got odd, morbid, artsy vibes from her, thinking that maybe she's in on something, but really, all the characters lack much in the way of palpable human qualities. For example, following the funeral, Hutch is talking to his girlfriend October and her eccentric brother Liam McPoyle at their internet cafe, and Hutch just casually and nonchalantly unloads this explosive piece of information.
All I know is that he was murdered, him and two of his friends.
Holy fucking shit, really?
Yeah, the performance is just too dispassionate for such drastic information. Like, your brother and his friends are being suspected of having been murdered, and you're very cold to this information. Like, I understand people grieve in their own way, and he's likely still processing everything, but nobody in the room seems to react that strongly to it. Hell, McPoyle even sardonically brushes it off as if it's some kind of joke, and his first response to seeing Hutch following his own brother's funeral is to be all like, tough break man, first your mum dies in a fire and now this, wow, your life sucks. By the way, I understand most people who see Jimmy Simpson will likely think of Always Sunny, but this was actually the first thing I ever saw him in, so it's quite jarring going back to this film after experiencing this.
Now I'd ask you guys to leave, but I'm just too damn happy. See you bitches on the dance floor.
Anyway, Phineas suggests that to help cheer up Hutch, they should get the gang together and celebrate Loomis's life by playing the game he and his friends played on the night of their deaths, because that doesn't sound a bit fucked up. Now, just before we get into the game, I want to quickly address Hutch's backstory. It's revealed Hutch has a traumatic fear of fire as a result of a house fire started by his father after he accused Hutch and Loomis's mother of having an affair. It resulted in their mother dying, their father being imprisoned, and Hutch being left with severe burn scars. And the reason for this specifically elaborate piece of information is nothing but pure character garnish, to force the illusion of there being some subtextual, poetically ironic element to Hutch overcoming the evil in the end. On paper, it's a noble element, but if you want to add an emotional layer to your horror film, why not just play on the brothers' clear love for video games? Maybe it's a comfort for them during times of stress and anxiety. It could have even been used as a positive message for video games. I mean, I've talked about how it's helped me in the past and how to cope with horror as a mechanism for the stresses, anxieties, fears, and uncertainties we deal with. I mean, this is exactly what Rain On Me did when using Shadow of the Colossus as a symbol for the main character's mental health. Anyway, with that said, this finally takes us to Stay Alive, which sees Hutch, October, Phineas, Abigail, who Hutch invites for no real reason, Miller, Hutch's friend and boss, playing via his office because we need an obligatory isolated death to kick off proceedings, and Swink, played by Frankie Muniz, who I'll admit was actually the main reason I was interested in seeing this film upon release, because at the time, Malcolm in the Middle was one of my favourite shows ever. When they boot up the game, I was legitimately met with an overwhelming sense of excitement as a brooding Clive Barker-esque exposition narrator tells us the backstory while the group make their characters comically identical to how they look in the moment, except for Swink, who channels every insecure teenager by making his avatar ripped as fuck. Outside the giddy nostalgia I had for the game itself, the lore is easily the best thing Stay Alive has going for it. It explains that in the 1800s, a countess called Elizabeth Bathory built Garouge Plantation as a finishing school for young girls, only to later discover that Elizabeth depravedly tortured and murdered the girls so that their blood, in the cursed words of the game, could cleanse and preserve Elizabeth's eternal beauty like some sort of vampire. The ultimate goal of the game is to fight through the cursed plantation to discover the truth behind Elizabeth and destroy her once and for all. Now, unless you're into obscure, dark medieval history, it turns out Elizabeth Bathory was actually a real Hungarian countess, accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of girls during her reign in the late 1500s, as explained in a 2022 article by Ronan O'Connell for National Geographic. It's said the true story is open to debate, with some theorists believing the accusations to be a conspiracy to drive her out of power, where she was eventually imprisoned until her death, while others argue strong evidence exists of her atrocities, such as eyewitness accounts and even a ledger said to hold the victims' names. In fact, when I said the lore reminded me of a vampire, a quick glance at the Wikipedia shows there were a lot of attempts to associate her with Dracula, with D. Gordon's dubious book, Bad Girls from History, Wicked or Misunderstood, stating that Elizabeth was raised around violence, abuse, a nurse who practiced black magic, an uncle who worshipped the devil, and apparently an aunt accused of being a witch. It sounds like complete fabrication, or at the very least highly sensationalized, but the bit that says she allegedly bathed in and drank the blood of virgin girls as a de-aging ritual is exactly how she's portrayed in Stay Alive, just with a Southern American gothic twist to it. The characters quickly discover they can't access the game until they verbally recite the Prayer of Elizabeth, which summons her spirit as the group's co-op action horror shenanigans finally begin. Now, it does try to force the idea of tension when the game starts by having Hutch slowly move his character and everyone be like, "OMG, where are you going? Get back here, what are you doing?" It's as if they've never played nor seen a video game before. Hutch then kills the tutorial enemy, an undead girl, a victim of Elizabeth, and they're all seemingly baffled as if it's some sort of big scary revelation. Eventually, they find themselves trying to escape an army of undead killer children, as Miller gets separated and discovers a gruesome torture room where he's insta-killed by Elizabeth, the woman in red, and decides then to call it a night, only to, oh my god, die the same way he died in the game, by getting stabbed in the fucking throat. I will say, despite the unrealistic gamer reactions as if they're cavemen discovering fire, Adam Goldberg does play up the fear quite well. It helps that his character's on cocaine because, remember, this is the unrated version, but he at least elevates the predictable suspense with an actual performance. The next day, Hutch is left shocked by Miller's death and becomes just a little too quick to suspect there's a correlation between the deaths in the game and the deaths in real life. It leads to some padded out scenes of flashing imagery and jump scares to show how the game begins to mess with the characters' heads, something which Swink attempts to rationalize as perceptive reality, a vague, bogus term to describe what's basically light paranoia. However, it's the only instance of any true psychological horror. Now, where things get quickly frustrating is when the group discover that the game doesn't play by its own rules and can actively cheat against the player's control, as is the case when Phineas is scared off an empty road by a spirit and abruptly mowed down by Elizabeth's speeding carriage, yet his character never actually dies in the game, at least until after he dies in real life. Okay, so here's the thing, I like the premise behind what it's going for. Elizabeth cheating makes sense because what reason does evil ever have to play by any sort of rules, and it does eventually allude to the curse and the game being separate from each other anyway, in that it's reciting the opening prayer that sets off the curse, not so much playing the game itself. The problem, however, is that it throws the implication of rules under the bus, or well, carriage, way too early, thus taking away any fun in watching the group trying to figure out how the game works and how it can be exploited, which is a large part of the enjoyment in curse films like Final Destination, Smile, It Follows, and so on. It's then contradicted by all the moments where it does link the curse to playing the game, such as Elizabeth mimicking the game deaths in real life, and how the game can be used to manipulate reality. I mean, it's effectively a video game version of The Ring, but without the consistency and mystery that made it feel urgent and exciting. If it wanted to make up for its lack of substance with fun deaths and gore, however, the only noteworthy one is a brash detective who plays the game and dies in a saw-like torture device, which is then summoned upon him while alone in his car. The overall concept is just severely undercooked despite having a bunch of quality raw ingredients in there. Hell, on the topic of Saw, it even reminded me of Saw creators James Wan and Lee Winnell's Dead Silence, which had a slightly campy, supernatural gothic quality to it, but took the horror way too seriously to the point it was a drab and dreary film rather than something that had any sort of thrill to it. When it comes to the unrated version's extra character and subplot, my assumption is that it's referring to the game's actual developer, who Hutch and Abigail confront at a house that's clearly supposed to be Garouge Plantation. The reason I think this was cut from the theatrical version is because it makes absolutely no sense and leaves more questions than answers about the logic of the evil. The developer explains that he simply based the game on Elizabeth Bathory's tale and that's it. He knows nothing about the curse or the effects his own game has on those who played it. Maybe it's a bluff, you say, and Elizabeth is actually his ancestor or something like that, but nope. He genuinely is just as clueless despite the fact it's established that nobody can actually play the game unless they read the opening poem aloud. Surely the developer knew this himself. Surely he's played his own game. Hell, he put the poem in there, so shouldn't he be dead too? What's worse is that this is his only scene, and the next time we see him, it's his blink and you miss a corpse. Oh, after the exposition dump, now he's dead. Surely to Christ, the room filled with torture trinkets, documents of the murders and so on must lead to something. You mean the film couldn't even do the bare minimum of associating him with the evil? The only way you can waste this much potential is if you practically go out of your way to avoid using any of it. The developer directs them to the author of a book called The Lady of Blood, which briefly mentions the original story, but never addresses the poem clearly being the summoning device. Does that mean if anyone reads the poem in any context, the prayer still summons Elizabeth? It then doubles down on the vampire illusion when October explains that she read a book called The Witch's Hammer that explains that the only way to exorcise her spirit is to find her corpse, hammer 3 nails through her heart, neck, and forehead, and burn the body. Sounds random, as it did for me, but again, like Elizabeth, it turns out this is based on a real scripture which, according to Britannica, was basically a guide to witch hunting and prosecution throughout Europe, and apparently heavily responsible for the witch hysteria we all know and hate. So what we're dealing with is a sort of supernatural vampire witch tulpa apparition of sorts. I mean, it can't just pick one lane and stick in it, it just overcomplicates itself to the point that it's not really clear what the evil is meant to be. Sure, it helps make it open to interpretation, but on the other hand, I can't tell if it's overcooked or undercooked in the process. Anyway, it doesn't end well for October, who's slain while the group attempt to hide from the police, who suspect them of being responsible for the murders. It culminates in Hutch, Abigail, and Swink going back to the developer's house where they finally realize it's the plantation the game is modeled after, prompting Swink to continue playing the game to act as a decoy, while Hutch and Abigail seek Elizabeth's body. It eventually leads to a pretty cool scene where Swink uses the game to guide Hutch around the plantation to find Abigail, who gets attacked after they split up for some reason, despite it proving fatal thus far, and Swink even discovers he can drop in-game items into the world to aid Hutch. Again, it's small things like this that show a lot of potential. It totally could have taken some more insight from Nightmare on Elm Street, such as pulling things out of the game into the real world, or conversely, showing that Elizabeth's abilities are limited in the real world based on factors within the game. In particular, the one great idea the film has going for it is how wild roses can be used to extinguish Elizabeth and any surrounding evil presence, which luckily for Swink comes just at the right time when the game cheats again by locking him away from his laptop, allowing Elizabeth to chase and seemingly kill him with her shears. I mean, it's clearly set up as a false death because we know he's surrounded by wild roses before Elizabeth stabs him, so Hutch and Abigail seeing his dead avatar on screen does little to misdirect his obvious survival. They eventually find Elizabeth in the very blatant tower that nobody seemed to notice before, and once again they get separated. Abigail is strung up and about to have her blood bathed in, while Hutch performs the execution ritual only to awaken the real Elizabeth. It ends up being a bit of a whimper when Hutch stuns her with her reflection on the Alienware laptop, because vampires and reflections or something like that, and he then sets her alight with Loomis's lighter, thus symbolically reflecting him overcoming his childhood trauma, hence the poetically ironic story behind his deceased mother. That was the fucking payoff. Swink and Abigail then come to the rescue, and the trio live happily ever after, at least until the game somehow gets an official release, and the curse ends up in the hands of the public, or at least PS2 owners, because, as we all know, Xbox is for noobs. And there we have it, Stay Alive, a sprinkle of good ideas and a really fun looking game that ages nicely with nostalgia, but ultimately an underwhelming supernatural horror that could have taken better influence from The Ring, Final Destination, and Elm Street. I'm so glad I finally got to cover this, so please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, including your requests, and until next time, stay safe, stay alive, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.